big thanks out to our sponsors. So without Codify and Microsoft, this would not be possible. So really big thanks to these guys. They're awesome. Codify provides the beer and the pizza when it arrives, and Microsoft the venue. So that's great. This is a community group, and we love people to get involved. So at the moment, we've got some opportunities available. So if anyone's keen to present, it doesn't, it can be anything. It can be your experiences. It could be nearly nothing at this stage, with the opportunities that you have today.
I'm really keen to hear about this technology.
It's the best one. It's kind of true. So reach out to us if you're keen to get up and say something. We'd love to hear you. It doesn't have to be the whole session. We can put a couple of small talks together. Totally okay. Just love to hear what you think about your experiences. Doesn't have to be the cutting edge stuff. Sometimes the talks that are most popular are the ones that you think people are all doing, but they're not. They're really looking how to do those things that are commonly done. So they're the ones that do bring in a lot of attention. So they're pretty good. Yeah, there's our contact. Let us know. All right, cool. So I'm going to flick this over to Dan because he's photobombed a job opportunity with my slides.
Right. If anybody's looking for a new adventure, we certainly would love to hear from you at Deloitte. Deloitte, you might probably mostly known, I guess, for doing auditing and financial counseling and tax and stuff like that. But actually, the largest part of the business is consulting. And in that, we have a very large IT area. We've got core business operations, Deloitte Digital, and if you're adept in any one of those technologies and keen to find a new role and solve wicked business problems from some awesome clients, then we definitely love to hear from you. So you can come speak to me. You can scan that QR code or reach out to Dan. Thanks.
Awesome. Oh, do you want me to go back?
Oh, is that okay? It's not for meeting.
Oh, sure. That's what they all say. Can someone photograph Michelle? Photograph me too.
I might have to get Bethy later. I'll start.
So we are posting these slides later on. So if you want to grab them, you can. All right. So a few updates this month. There's lots of pretty pictures. There's not a lot of words in this section of slides. So be thankful for that. You don't need to think a lot. You don't need to read a lot. A few things to call out. Inside Engines. Azure's up there in the leaders. I can't actually read the screen from here. I might have to turn around. I think I did that right. Yep. We've got integration paths, yet again, up there in the leaders quadrant. Public cloud, same. Up there with computer vision AI, maybe just creeping ahead of the pack there. They're doing pretty well on that one, and that's different. I don't know what that's called. Different group of people selling stuff. Analysts, that's it. That's what not salespeople, analysts. Open AI service went GA recently, so this month. So it was in a private preview for a while. It's gone into GA. That's got it's got on my mind. Anyway, it's got GPT 3.5, which is the engine that ChatGPT uses, but trained on data differently. But you've got Codex, it's got DALL-E 2. There's an interesting timeline there of all of the AI advancements in Azure. So I thought that was interesting, rather than boring you with lots of other stuff. So that's an interesting service. Check it out. New Relic. I don't know how many people here have used New Relic. Anyone? Yep. We got a few. Oh, got more than we expected. New Relic's great. It's kind of like your App Insights, but it was around before App Insights. It's a really good tool. They now have it's in the marketplace. It's it's not as hard as what it used to be. It used to be a real nightmare to get that up and going in Azure. That's now a lot easier. Nginx as a service. With those crazy letters at the end. So lots of people have used Nginx, I'm sure. You can now pull that off the marketplace as well. That's pretty cool. And load testing. So we've been talking about this last couple of sessions. That's gone GA this month. So that's pretty cool. It's great to see. So it's just basically JMeter scripts and a whole bunch of VMs basically doing your distributed load test and pulling back your results and get a nice dashboard. That's a little bit better than I don't know if people have used Load Run or anything like that in the past. That's a different kettle of fish. But this is a much better experience. All right, cool. So that was it. Bit of a whirlwind session. We've got a few resources that we just plugged. So we've got a Slack, we've got a YouTube, we've got some training opportunities. I've updated some of I put Azure Friday in there because I was always looking at that thinking, why don't I plug in that? It's a great place to go and see some videos. Right, tonight. So, without any further ado, we've got two sessions, so we might see if we can... And you're first. Okay. So we do have Michelle coming up. You're all going to have to wait. And the reason we put Michelle last is because that keeps everybody here. Sorry, Dan.
Saving the best to last.
Save the best to last. So we're going to do a little bit of Azure Workbooks and cost optimization with Michelle. And without any further ado, we're going to introduce someone who doesn't really need any introduction.
TBD.
He's here again. So Dan's going to introduce some of the new Azure Integration Services landing zones. Take it away.
So integration is hard, right? How many people have been involved in having to build integration, right? And would you agree that, yeah, it's challenging, right? It's a difficult problem to solve. And basically, one of the things that, some of the other companies that offer integration products do really, really well, like I'm thinking MuleSoft and Toomey and TIBCO and all those companies, SnapLogic, is that they sell an integration solution, right? It's a package. It's something they market really, really well because customers know exactly what they're buying. They're buying an entire integration platform, right? Whereas in the Microsoft land, when we sell integration, we say, well, what is your integration product? And we say Azure. Well, you can see the problem with that, right? Because Azure is huge. It's this enormous toolbox of hundreds of services and stuff. And when you try to that do many, many, many things, integration being one of them, and it does it well, but trying to sell that to a customer, they don't see the integration product, right? So when I say we, I mean people who had the ear of the product group, like the Microsoft MVPs and the partners. A couple of years ago, kind of complained a little bit that the Microsoft said it's a bit of a challenge for us to sell this integration. And we know what the services are that are used, but it's not so obvious to other people, right, who aren't Microsoft integration experts. So what Microsoft did is they took a few of the products that we use regularly in integration solutions, and they put a name over it, and they called it Azure Integration Services. And that's all it really is a label that's put over a collection of services that are already there in Azure. Now, that helps, I guess, a bit, but it's also still a little bit confusing because, for one thing, I've seen 5 different versions of this diagram and with different services being depicted in it. So the services that are there, that's certainly not all the things that we use in integration solutions. And some of the things that are there aren't used exclusively for integration either. It's made up of any one of these things that might be involved. And then there's even others too, like IoT hubs, for example, might be in there. So it helps a little bit, but it's still somewhat confusing, right? So I spent 5 minutes going over that context to kind of understand, set the stage for what's being done here. So now that we know what Azure Integration I should probably explain more about what Azure Integration Services is. These services are ones that we commonly use in integration problems, and I'll just talk through them very briefly. So if we start from the upper right, functions, everybody here probably knows what Azure Functions are, right? It's ability to run arbitrary code. Not explicitly integration related necessarily, but it's certainly useful in integration solutions, especially when you're building microservice type, or backends for APIs. Data Factory is your ETL type of thing. So when you're moving large amounts of data between different places, you can think of it as, how many of you know SSIS? The cloud as well. Service Bus is enterprise messaging, and messaging is at the heart of almost every integration solution. I can't think of a single cloud-based integration solution we had that didn't include Service Bus, right? Because it's so robust in the way it does it. Event Grid for managing event notifications. What's not here in this diagram is Event Hub, which is also used for streaming lots of events. They both have different strengths and they solve different problems, but they're related to event management. API management, of course, is your API gateway. It's how you expose your APIs and put all the goodness that comes over it, like your security, your rate limiting, your, what do you call it? Like your customer tier levels, and you can control your access. You can monetize it. You can, for your APIs, develop against them. If you don't know much about API management, check it out. It's an amazing product and all that it can do. And logic apps for building your workflows, and also having connectors, built-in connectors. I think there's almost 500 of them right now to connect to just about every kind of cloud service that you can imagine, as well as all of the Azure services and even on-premise solutions. So that's that view of what Azure Integration Services is a couple of ones that they didn't include on that particular diagram, but I think that those are the main ones. Okay. So with that, what is a landing zone? What do we mean when we say landing zone? Well, then top quote is Microsoft Azure's definition of what it is, but essentially think of it as a prepackaged environment. Click a button and instant presto, you've got yourself a whole environment or a platform. Well, maybe not be so instant. It probably takes about 4 hours to deploy, especially with some of the API management and a few other things that it works. But essentially, it gets you started from zero to nothing, from nothing to a full platform for you. And it should be, if it's done well, it's scalier, which everything in Azure is anyway, but if it's done properly. I mean, Azure in concept, all of the services are scalable, but of course, you have to build your applications with that in mind to make your application scalable. Modular in that, because it supplies a full platform, there may be bits that you don't need, and you want to have the option to, plug and play the things that you need for your solution. And you can also define a landing zone in two types. One being platform, which basically gives you your infrastructure type aspects, so that would be your networking, your identity, all that kind of stuff. And the other would be application, where you're actually building a functional solution for something. Okay, so that's landing zones, and those QR codes, by the way, all work for the pages that define this, and I will be sharing these slides. So the Azure Integration Services landing zone, which just was released a couple of months ago, is obviously basically building you an integration platform. The things that are most likely needed if you're going to build an integration solution in Microsoft Azure. Now, it does include all the ARM templates that you need to actually deploy these services, which is great, and it is definitely very modular and plug and play, and I'll show you what that looks like later. But I think one of the most useful things about this is also a collection of articles that's reference documentation that tells you how to use this stuff. And that is really, I think, probably the most useful part of it. It's teaching you how to design your integration solutions. And after what I said before, integration is hard, right? It's not easy. It's not intuitive to everyone, and we often see it done badly. I think this fills a really big gap for us. So what I'm going to do, basically, the design areas that it covers are these 6 areas. And if you're like me, if you're an expert in one area like integration, like I am, an integration expert, you kind of look at these things and you realize, wow, this is really handy, because as an integration expert, I'm not a network expert. I'm also not a security expert, right? And these are things that I have to solve, but I need to know how to navigate all these things when I'm building integration solutions. So it's great that they've concentrated, that what they're not giving you here is like integration patterns, right? Because those are things that as an integration architect I should know about. But this stuff is really helpful. So what I'm going to do is just walk through these 6 things and show you not what content is covered in the documentation, not teach you all the content, because you can go and read it for yourself, but just to give you an idea how thorough it is. So identity and access, obviously a very important thing, and when they talk about everything is usually broken up into design considerations and design recommendations. So considerations about, thinking about what do I need in my solution? What are the roles that have to be catered for in this solution, and who's going to be looking after it, and what are their responsibilities? You need to know that. And of course, what kind of resources it is that you're going to secure with your identity management. And then of course, the design recommendations, obviously principle of least privilege. So you want to give people only the permissions that they need, and not more than that. Azure policy, you're going to see mentioned a lot in these areas, because it is such a powerful tool for being able to enforce that kind of governance and regulation for how you implement stuff. And role-based access control, obviously anybody who's worked with Azure AD would know what that's all about. And you can assign permissions from the most broadest scope possible, like a subscription, all the way down to like a row in a database if you want to. You can literally get that granular if you want to define those permissions. So that's identity and access management. Network topology, I mean, this is the largest of all the articles that they have, and you can see all the stuff that they cover in here. They literally go through every one of these services and tell you how you can connect it to a virtual network and the way you get it to work. And that's such valuable information. They have phenomenal diagrams and explanations of all of it. I will show you that for sure. That's one of the things, I think, one of the most valuable parts of this. Security, again, lots of things to think about with security. You need to figure out what mechanisms you're going to use, things like managed identities, obviously role-based access control, where you do your encryption, firewalls and all of that stuff. Again, a lot of documentation how to do this. OAuth 2. Yeah, well, people still don't quite get OAuth 2. I'm not sure I get it completely myself, but it goes covered very well and all of that. So another big article that's very helpful. Management. This is often a thing that's an afterthought to your applications. Is how are the people going to look after it once it's deployed? And what tools are you giving them to do that? When I started out with Microsoft stuff, it was when we were still back in the Stone Age using servers. It was BizTalk Server was the big product that we were experts in. And one of the features, most powerful features of BizTalk Server was business activity monitoring, or BAM, as we called it. And it was also the least used aspect of it, which was always a shame, because it was an afterthought. Rather than when you design your solutions up front, think about how you want to do your monitoring. What is it you really need to track? Not only just from a diagnostic perspective, so you can tell when something goes wrong, how can you, find your logs and your trace, but also from an executive perspective, if they want to know what's actually going on in your business, what's happening. And integration is the perfect place to elevate all that, because all your data is flowing through your integration, right? But you have to build your solution with that in mind, so you can capture that data. And it even goes into mentioning third-party tools too, like Serverless 360, which is a product by Kabai. And I think we might have heard that mentioned a couple of months ago when we had Z from India, who did the virtual presentation for us. Sample Kusto queries is really cool too, because Kusto is the language that Log Analytics uses for querying. And it's maybe not terribly intuitive at first, but giving an example queries kind of helps get you started, jump started with that. Governance, another thing that you need to think about in an organization is how are you going to ensure that people are complying with your standards, and how are you going to enforce that? So again, a lot of really helpful information there. Again, you see Azure Policy. Azure Policy is a very, very powerful tool for being able to enforce those standards both at design time and during runtime. So really helpful there. Again, I call out to Azure Monitor, obviously, for monitoring, and also Serverless 360. So Serverless 360, if you don't know the product, one of the things it can do is it puts a layer over Azure where you can actually fine-tune all the actions and activities that people can do without actually having to give them direct access to Azure. So it has its own sort of role-based management layer on top of Azure, which is a lot easier to use, a lot more intuitive. And Microsoft Defender as well. And then finally, of course, last but not least, is DevOps and automation, and the importance of being able to have that really good solution in place. Automation obviously gives you consistency, being able to do things the same way each time and across each environment, and also able to use it to enforce standards and compliance and the quality of your code and everything with your automated testing and everything. So there's a lot of great tips in there as well. And then finally, you get to the reference architecture, and this is where we have all of our ARM templates so that you can deploy the solution. So there is a deploy to Azure button, which will deploy everything in it. If you want to do that, keep in mind that as soon as you do that, you're racking up charges, right? And be aware that a lot of these services are going to be deployed at the premium tier level. The reason for that is because it also deploys a virtual network, and it connects all these things to a virtual network. And if you work with these services, you'll know that you don't get VNet integration until the premium level, most of the services. So keep that in mind. That may seem like a pain if you don't really need that, but it's actually better that they do it that way, because you can go, generally it's more complex to figure out how to implement that VNet integration than it is to remove it if you don't want it. You can always go in and edit what you need and take it out. But they give you the more complex solution, because that's probably going to help you the most. It's going to be where you have the most trouble. And they do it in a very modular way. So this is how it's actually organized. By the way, all of this is I forgot to mention, is in a Git repo, so it's all open source. You can go in and copy it all down and then make changes. And here's the pizza.
What's my transit?
All right, so this is it. Where you land, you go to this GitHub repo, and I'll have the link posted in the slide deck for you. And you can see what you have. You have your scenarios. Right now, there's only one scenario, which will deploy the reference architecture that you saw on that slide. And let me go back again. But I wanted to take you into the actual documentation. So there's a nice article here, and then you have on the title page the links to all the different sections in the design document. And if I go to network and topology, for example, you can see how much stuff that there is here. It's quite a long article with lots of diagrams and talks through all these concepts about DNS and encryption and how you connect to on-prem. And then you have all the individual services and how to connect to them. So network design for API management, for storage accounts, for app service environments, and it just goes on and on and on. So that's one of the bigger articles in here. But all of those sections have an article just like that. It's cool. And then if I go back to where we have the ARM templates are all in here, I believe. Yeah. So there's all your folders with your various ARM templates, including the main template, which you can then edit. You can pull this down and make a copy and then use it. So let me go back to my slides.
Not sure where the pizza went.
No, yeah, he was actually saying that he got held up, but it's going to be 7:15 now. So.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, sorry, but easy. And that's really pretty much what I was going to present to you. So I've got a bunch of links in this slide that you can go and check this stuff out for yourself. And yeah, I was supposed to hide that slide. There you go. Here we go. That's it. Are there any questions?
Mostly distracted by how we don't look on the recording. Okay, cool. So what we're going to have a look at is how we can do some cost optimization, so that one of the core sort of FinOps is under what they call FinOps. So one of our colleagues, so I'm Michelle, as we saw in the slide, that was Winston, who was with me, and I'm a customer engineer, and I work with Bernie and Sam, and has put together a way that we can actually use Azure Monitor workbooks to visualize and get that insight into how our cloud resources are configured, so that we can make visible what our resource configurations are, and easily see if they're optimized for that cost, keeping that cost down. So probably everyone has experienced the fun of the consumption model and getting charges relating to cloud services, and then sort of being a bit surprised in what that can look like sometimes. So when we look at our cloud spend, we actually look at the charges, but we also look at how we've configured our resources and how we actually design our workloads. We now need to think about how much they're going to cost as part of that design, and then on an ongoing basis, and see and potentially treat that as one of our key measures in the success of our solution. So within Azure Monitor, can use a feature called Azure Monitor Workbooks, and that's a good user group presentation idea if we haven't had the opportunity to do that. So next week we'll have TBD, next month we'll have TBD, the month after that we'll have TBD, and then after that we'll have Azure Monitor Workbooks maybe. Yeah, but I'm really loving the sound of this new product, TBD. So Azure Monitor Workbooks, the very abridged version is that we can actually join different data sources within Azure. For example, log analytics data, Azure Resource Graph, and you can actually query the Resource Manager API to bring data into this single pane of glass called an Azure Monitor Workbook. And so what we have here is an example of an Azure Monitor Workbook that focuses on cost and FinOps, cost optimization approach. So Microsoft have got some documentation on best practices as well for cost optimization as part of the well-architected framework documentation. So we've got some there to provide further information. And there's a group called the FinOps Foundation, and they're a sort of like a working group all around the FinOps. Yep. So I'm just going to jump in and show us and we'll talk through some of the aspects of cost and ops and some of the best practices around sort of cost optimization in the cloud. So many organizations would like to have a way to apply or assign their cloud usage charges back to individual business units or cost centers, for example. And then we can actually, so what we have available in Azure, as with the other cloud providers, is we can actually tag our resources. And one way that we can do that is to get that chargeback opportunity is that we can actually tag our resources with a cost center or business unit, and all tags will actually appear in your cloud usage bill when it's generated. And then we can also use our tags to build workbooks like this to be able to then visualize our Azure resource data based on those tags as well. And you may already know that we can actually do our automation and ongoing maintenance on sets of resources based on their tag. So when we talk about sort of our FinOps way of working and the governance side of it, we do talk about having tags for defined and all sort of users consuming, building in the cloud, familiar with a tagging standard and how each tag and value will be used and why it's relevant. A couple of examples of some tags that we could use to assign to our resources for cost management would be, a cost center tag so that we can apply charges to a specific cost center, or a contact, so the name or email of a person that we can harass every month when we get the bill, which is what I like to use it for. And then so we can actually, as I mentioned, build our visualizations and our reporting on our costs around those tags. And then it makes it easier for us to bring and discuss our cloud charges and resource configurations with the right audiences, the audiences that are using all the contact people for those resources. So one of the things is when we look at our optimization and FinOps approach, and as part of good cloud governance is to just ensure that we have that good tagging policy, a tagging policy in place, and that we've got compliance with that tagging policy. Not just because we like to boss people around and make sure that they like to follow the rules. It's just so that we can get that reporting and insights out of their charges data. So this workbook actually helps us assess our tagging compliance in relation to tagged versus untagged resources. And we can see here that in this environment, we've got 80 different unique resource tags and a number of different values. And unfortunately, we've got a large number of untagged resources as well. So this Azure Monitor workbook is a nice way to make that visual. Cool. So we've got our piece around tagging, and then so when another part of our sort of cloud governance approach for cost optimization is now in Azure, you have the Azure Advisor available to you. And so Azure Advisor is a service that's going to provide insights and recommendations to you across the 5 pillars, such as cost optimization, security. Someone else tell me what the other ones are? Operation. Performance efficiency, operational excellence, and mystery other ones. Resiliency. Reliability. See, I'm doing my homework. So when you next go into Azure Portal, do a search for Azure Advisor and just pop in there and have a look at that and the recommendations that may be made. So we've got this workbook filtered to the Azure Advisor cost recommendations, and we can see here that we've got one recommendation to either right size or shut down underutilized virtual machines. So in the golden days where we had our virtual machines running on machines in a data center, it would incur no extra cost to us to have them turned on or turned off at times where we were using them, and probably not really practical. But when we are running resources, especially compute resources in the cloud, we're paying for them on an hourly basis, for example. So we're paying for what we use. So if we've got one thing we can do is take a look at our virtual machines, and if we're not using them, We can shut them down and remove them if they're not used for a significant period of time in a 24-hour period. For example, we know that our virtual machines are used only during business hours. Then we can shut down and deallocate our virtual machines and then avoid paying the costs for them while they're not running and not being used. So that's a bit about avoiding costs, and we'll talk about sort of optimizing for costs as well. So Azure Advisor will be continuously sort of scanning your environment and popping out recommendations for you. And we can see here that we've got one where it's looked at a set of virtual machines and decided that we could benefit from a cost savings perspective by just changing our size from standard DS1 V2 to standard DS2 V3 and get some suggested annual savings out of them. I just noticed I'm a bit jealous that Sam somehow managed to get access to the elusive Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure demo environment, which I really needed access to today. So pardon me for being a bit distracted. Now, sometimes these recommendations aren't going to apply to you, and so you can actually suppress those recommendations, and it's like excluding them or acknowledging them in a way. So we can see here that in Sam's subscription, or it's actually in that dodgy Arc-enabled subscription, which I'm not welcome to, we've got some recommendations here and they haven't been suppressed. So they may not have been looked at, but they are designed to provide you with that insight into opportunities to where you can reduce your costs and some improvements across the other pillars: cost optimization, security, operational excellence, performance, and reliability. So sort of looking at another sort of one of the governance aspects of cloud optimization is sort of minimizing how much we have to pay from licensing. So licensing our Windows servers, for example, or our SQL server. So as part of the fee for a Windows server, by default, there's a license component, and that goes for an Azure Seed-based as well. Now, if you've already got Windows licenses or licenses for SQL Server, you can, and as part of migrating them to the cloud, you can take advantage of hybrid licensing, and that can actually take a reasonable amount away from the charges that you pay on a regular basis. So we do recommend sort of looking at what licenses you already have and what you could actually sort of take advantage of from a hybrid licensing perspective as well. So when we talk about using our dashboard and making our environment visible, we can see here that we've got a couple of virtual machines, Linux virtual machines running without Azure Hybrid benefit enabled, and some Windows VMs and VM scale sets without that Azure Hybrid benefit enabled. So if we did have some licenses available to it that we could sort of take advantage of, for example, for servers that have since been moved to the cloud, then we could actually sort of look here and say, well, actually, I expected that I was making use of my existing Windows licenses here. I'm going to go and apply those and save myself some dollars. So the same applies with your SQL Server licenses as well. So it appears that we're quite healthy here in our workbook. We're seeing that we've got no SQL servers that haven't had that hybrid license benefit applied to them.
So I'm just a little confused as to why the Red Hat Linux is there. Is Microsoft now a Red Hat reseller that can do a hybrid?
Yep, so there is, I believe that you can get some part of the hybrid licensing benefit can apply to Red Hat Enterprise Linux licenses now.
Sorry, just a comment. I like how you've highlighted that it's important to check that you have the actual license.
Yeah.
Because it's quite easy to just turn it on when you're doing it on the portal, or even the documentation is not clear about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it's actually not, it's not an insignificant amount, and what we can actually just quickly do is, are you guys familiar with the pricing calculator? oops. So we could pop in and see if I'll grab a SQL database because, yeah, as you say, when you're deploying through the portal or through a script or deploying some example code, it doesn't really often take into consideration the opportunity to apply the hybrid license benefit. So you could be missing out there, and it's good to have a visualization that you can regularly meet with users of cloud services within your organisation and continually inspect all these facets of this dashboard with them. So I'll just sort of show, so in relation to an Azure SQL database, if we sort of have a look at the sort of base option, and then so that price without a SQL license, incorporating the SQL license without bringing your own. So we call that hybrid benefit when we bring our own license. So it goes from $578 to $372. So it is a significant saving. Now this is actually just an Azure SQL database, single database with two vCores, but just to demonstrate that you can save quite a bit of dollars there. And then did I choose a virtual machine as well? So if we just picked, so I'm very guilty of not coming in and checking how much resources are going to cost before I deploy them. Is anyone else willing to own up to that? Yep. Okay. So if we choose, we'll just grab the default one. So sort of when we include the license in our monthly fee, we sort of, the average charge is about $94 for that component per month. But if we did bring our own license, it drops that cost down. So definitely worth looking into and just regularly inspecting that through a visualization like budgets. Who likes doing budgets? No. Okay. Well, we can actually define budget for our subscriptions, and we can actually apply them at other levels in our hierarchy as well. But if you're an organisation that uses a subscription as a landing zone for different cloud workloads, you can set a budget on that, and you can actually have alerts defined on how you're tracking towards that budget. So what we have here in our workbook is just a prompt to get us to sort of, go through and just make sure that we've got sort of budgets defined for our Azure subscriptions. So if we were using this workbook as part of our regular monthly cost governance meeting with our consumers of cloud services within our organisation, we could step through this page and talk to them about how they're tracking towards their budget versus actual spend. So we do encourage having sort of budgets defined for our workloads as part of that sort of, not just part of that project sort of initiation process, but also on an ongoing basis as well for the lifetime of a workload running in Azure. So that's sort of it on the sort of some of the stuff that you could look at from a governance perspective, using and making it visible. So yeah, so the workbook includes sort of a lot of tips as well. So as you go through it as part of your ongoing cloud process, it's got some good tips and prompts. If you're like me, kind of, something goes in and then something has to come out, and then you're forgetting everything all the time. And so it's really helpful to have, these prompts here. And so this is just one example of how we can actually visualize our cost and our configuration. So using a workbook, but we've also got access to the actual Azure, the cloud spending data as well through the cost management and billing service. You can actually configure, I believe that Microsoft have created a Power BI template app that brings your cost management data to you in as a pre-prepared data set. But I think that's only available to enterprise agreement customers, but you can also make that cost data visible through your own customized process as well. And then so as we sort of talk about in the next section of the workbook, when we talk about how we configure and optimize our resources, we can actually use Azure Policy to sort of put in place some organisational standards to, stop people from maybe accidentally provisioning virtual machines that are, ridiculously large, or, maybe not deploying virtual machines that don't have tags as well, which is a good example. So there's just some nice guidance here on how we can actually make other aspects of cost management visible to our internal customers. Cool. So sometimes, over here we mentioned sometimes we get surprised that we've deployed virtual machines, for example, without hybrid benefit enabled, and making it visible can be helpful to, make those things visible. Sometimes when we deploy virtual machines, every time you deploy a virtual machine, it's going to get deployed with at least one network interface card and some storage, and you can optionally attach additional storage to it, or disks. Now, depending upon how that's actually deployed and whether or not what settings are applied, will determine whether or not those additional resources will actually get deleted when the virtual machine is deleted. And so what can happen is we can sometimes find that we've got network cards, public IP addresses, and additional disks are still sitting in our environment that are no longer attached to a virtual machine. So they're almost orphans. And so you will actually continue to be charged for those resources, even though they're not even when they're not providing any value to you. So this is one of the things that we can look at through our visualizations here. So we can actually see that we've got some. So it's using the Azure Resource Graph query, which is another place you can use Gusto query language, which is good fun, to identify disks that are not attached to a virtual machine. So you may, in some cases, have a valid reason for having disks floating around without being attached to a virtual. One example is if you have a process that creates and deletes virtual machines and reuses those disks. But we do often find that the customers unintentionally have orphaned resources floating around. So some things to sort of be aware of, and we can make that visible to you either through an Azure Monitor workbook or just using the Azure Resource Graph queries to create your own custom solution. So just as disks and public IPs, I hadn't thought of this one. You could potentially have an orphaned app service plan. So I presume that's an app service plan that's not got any web apps or function apps running on it, which is going to be something that you're going to be paying for and not getting any use out of. And similarly, we could potentially have orphaned application gateways, load balancers, and front door services. So this subscription's pretty good here that we would be being charged for, but not getting any value out of. So another thing to sort of be able to inspect on a regular basis. I'll just show you if I can. I might just pop into edit mode, and this will be an input test. Okay. So if you're not familiar with Azure Monitor workbooks, so under the covers, what's happening is we're able to run an Azure Resource Graph, which is one example. So what we're doing here is running an Azure Resource Group query and looking for resources that are Microsoft Compute disks and that don't actually have a corresponding attachment to a virtual machine. So that's just one example of one data source that we can bring into an Azure Monitor that we can also query. Use the Resource Graph API and log analytics queries as well as a couple of examples there. So these visualizations are driven from the Azure Resource Graph. I'll just pop out of edit mode before I get too lost and before I break something. So one thing that we find, and this page loads a little bit slowly, but one thing that we find, I'll just talk about, here it goes, is that when capturing or sending a lot of diagnostic logs to log analytics, we can find that that's an opportunity to get some unexpected cloud charges. So while we want to, have that ability to visualize what's going on within our environment and what events are occurring in our environment, which is what log analytics lets us do, we do sort of want to be able to regularly inspect what we're capturing and what value it's actually providing us, and most importantly, how much it's costing us. So we can do this through sort of looking at each individual log analytics workspace and sort of how much data we're actually capturing. And so, like with many of the other sort of facets that this workbook covers, we've got some guidance around sort of log analytics, what sort of logs and what retention period we want to define, because all of those will sort of add up to some resource charges. So this is an opportunity where we can do some optimization around those. So we've got some guidance here on the sort of advice for capturing logs, and potentially to use a commitment tier to keep those costs down here. And then this is actually making visible all the log workspaces that we have in our environment, and then we're able to click on each individual log workspace and see how much data is going in there, which is going to influence how much we're being charged. Yep. So storage accounts. We've all got storage accounts. We're all secret hoarders. So we've got sort of some guidance on a page here for customers using storage accounts. And so it's worth mentioning as well that, so you might be familiar with virtual machine reservations as a way to reduce your charges for using virtual machines. So you can actually have reserved capacity. So we have capacity reservations for other services like storage accounts. So that's an option for you to look at as part of avoiding charges if you know that you're going to be using those services for and storing certain amounts of data for and durations of time, periods of time. So additionally, sort of with storage accounts, you may be familiar that we've got the sort of the different access tiers, so hot, cold and archive, and then so they're charged at a different rate. And so we can actually look here that we've got mostly our storage accounts here are configured with the hot access tier, which are going to be charged. So how you get charged for a storage account is the storage and the transaction. So you'll be charged at different rates for different access tiers. So if you don't, so what the hot access tier is for when you're accessing data frequently, and if you have data that's accessed less frequently, then you could look at using an access tier such as cold or even archive. But then so you start to pay a little bit more when you start to access data on those cold or archive storage tier. And it can take a period of time to access data on an archive storage tier, but you will save some dollars there. So we can sort of visualize the settings around our storage accounts as well.
So there's some advice on the useful cost.
Yep. So, oh, yep. So we can also, so you've got a couple of other things to consider in relation to your costs as well with storage accounts. So you may be aware that you can configure the different SKU name or determine whether or not the storage, how that storage is replicated, whether locally, zonally, or geographically. And so when we're planning our storage accounts, we can have we can have a think that locally redundant storage is going to be cheaper than zone redundant storage. And then zone redundant storage is going to be cheaper than geographically redundant storage. And so may consider as part of planning our storage accounts for non-production environments, whether we need geo-redundant replication, or could we go for a less expensive option of using locally redundant storage for those environments as well. So we can think about that as another opportunity to save some costs. Yeah.
So what are the columns for storage? You've got the scroll bar.
Oh, you want me to scroll over here? Apologies, I'll just scroll up.
Well, I was just thinking there was going to be a recommendation based on number of transactions, whether it should go to cold or archive.
Yeah, no, that's actually a good suggestion. Oh yeah, and then I think this is primarily used to see if it's actually being used, as opposed to recommending whether or not we could go to hot, cold or archive. And then the other one is sort of around sort of the V1 versus V2 generation storage accounts. And so looking at, so There's additional features available in V2 storage accounts that aren't available in V1 storage accounts, and they have a different charging model. So you'll get the lowest gigabyte capacity prices for Azure storage, as well as very competitive transaction prices. And going with a V2 account, you can also sort of set default access tiers, either being hot, cool, and blob level tiering between hot, cool, and archive, and you can configure. Oh, and the other recommendation that we have is sort of making use of lifecycle policies, so where you can actually define a policy that will actually migrate your data across from hot, cool, archive storage, depending upon a policy definition that you can see.
This is the process that generates the tier change, isn't it?
The workbook is just to sort of visualize what your current settings are, but the workbook is actually also including some guidance or reminders for us to consider, at what the options are for cost avoidance, so they are top of mind, or to help you. Yeah.
But you can click through on those things and then change it if you wanted to. Right?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Resource.
You can change it from
Yeah, so you can click on the storage account. If you wanted to make a change to it, then assuming that you're not.
thousands of
Yeah, you can use the life cycle policies that Michelle just mentioned before actually allows you to on bulk select a bunch of blobs and change tiers. Yeah.
Do you guys sometimes find that using lifecycle policies is not good? Because every time you move a tier, you actually pay for rights and reads and writes. And especially if you've got like millions of blobs you want to move.
There would be charges for reads and writes.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you don't sort of go 3 steps, maybe just one.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the main thing with lifecycle policies and blob tiering is that you don't want to flip-flop between them, right? Because obviously you increase additional transaction costs every time you change. So really it's, I guess, thinking about that data that then is aging out of the system, and that's where you want to move to core and to archive. You don't want to, because it's a reasonable amount of days too. Like you need to sort of not use it for a period of time. And if you use it once in like 90 days, then it's not worth going to that tier in the first place, right?
Just a small amount of advice.
What's that? Sorry, just a little bit. Okay. Yeah. Yep. So who's using Azure Kubernetes Service? So there's some really good advice here. And again, sort of we've got the mixture of providing the guidance in a single place and then actually being able to visualize the facets that we're making recommendations on. So some of the core recommendations for keeping our costs down when we're using Azure Kubernetes Service is to sort of implement the cluster auto scale, and that's a rule or guidance for any resources that support auto scale is that's a nice way to sort of scale up and down the resources based on actual usage. So you can then sort of start looking at taking that, well, I'm only going to pay for what I am actually using. So where possible, if in doubt, configure auto scaler, I guess. So another sort of cost reduction method is to consider using Azure Spot virtual machines. So not only does this advice on Spot virtual machines apply to Kubernetes, because they sit atop virtual machine scale sets, is that any sort of time you've got something that's making use of a virtual machine is that you could take an approach of using reserved instances, spot virtual machines, and to save some dollars. So good candidates for using Spot VMs is folks that are executing batch processing jobs, dev test environments, and stuff that doesn't mind too much having its resources evicted. Now you can actually, what's one other thing I'm going to call out? We have actually found sort of a few teams using Azure Kubernetes Service using the logging feature with significant gusto, and found that they've had some unexpected charges. So Sam's included links to all of his guidance on all of the options for scaling and keeping your costs down when using Azure Kubernetes Service. I won't go into too much detail here unless you ask me a question that I really won't be able to answer, and that would be awkward. Cool. And then sort of some general things that we sort of have a look at on a regular basis is okay, well, have we got resources that may have been created for experimental purposes that are still floating around in our environment and incurring charges? So this sort of section of the dashboard is sort of looking for any resources that might have the word test, POC, or delete in their name. So if you're like me, you'll create something, oh, that looks cool, I'm going to play with that for a while, and then you forget to get rid of it after you've finished with it. So this is just targeting that sort of scenario here. And yep, so then sort of this is just some generalized recommendations. So if you're using application insights, we can actually sort of our sampling rate and our retention for that application insights data that's being captured as part of sort of reducing our costs. And then some other sort of general recommendations is looking at any VPN gateways or Azure firewalls, which can be expensive. So we're actually looking at those types of resources that don't actually have any traffic going through them, which may indicate that they've been deployed there and aren't being used, but you're still being charged for them. So with Azure app services and plans, so we found earlier that we could potentially get ourselves into a situation where we've got an Azure app service plan that's deployed that hasn't actually got any websites or applications running on it, but we can actually also sort of look at optimizing our costs by sort of looking at implementing auto scaling, sort of thinking about how we can actually make use of a consolidated app service environment where applicable, and then so sort of hosting multiple workloads on a single app service plan instead of having a situation where you've got one app service plan per web or application, which can where you may not necessarily need that based on your workload or performance requirements. You may already be familiar, and we did mention it at the beginning. You can stop and deallocate your virtual machines to save being charged for them. If you've got a stopped web app or app on an app service plan, you're still charged for it. So it being stopped may indicate that it's no longer required, and so that could be removed, thus removing any fees associated with that. Cool. And yep, so you can also sort of look at using sort of an elastic SKU versus a static SKU, as well as part of thinking about the cost versus actual use from a cost versus usage perspective. Cool. Yep, so the workbook sort of covers, so there's a fair few sort of aspects where we can look at sort of different configurations and what we're doing in our environment that can influence our charges. And so another example of that is when we've deployed Azure Recovery Services or using Azure Backup Services, which would be backing up to a recovery services vault, for example. So we've got some guidance, and we're able to make visual sort of whether or not we've sort of implemented what sort of service tier for our storage accounts are being replicated either locally, zonally, or geographically, which does influence our charges. So you can actually then see consider what's actually appropriate for our specific needs, and how much size is being consumed by our recovery services vaults. What can influence our charges here again relates to the storage, so we can think about our data retention policies for our backups as part of a cost saving avoidance activity. So how this workbook works is we need to click on a specific recovery services vault, and that will trigger running another query in the background to advise us as to how much storage is being used in each case here. And then we've got a whole page here dedicated to recommendations around virtual machines and sort of your guidance on that. And we'll visualize here any virtual machines that you have deployed that are currently in a stopped state. Last but not least, so this page has got some general guidance and practical examples and links to some guidance around cost management and cost optimization.